Totally
so Dean had his donut moment, and these guys, they were like the food Nazis. And
they were. And so Robert and I were really like, come on, let Dean be human, for God's sake. And what scientist doesn't eat sugar and coffee? Like,
now, I have a story for you guys. Now, listen to this. This is for real. I'm not making this up. There's a company in Japan. They make a toilet that has sensors in the toilet, and it can detect from your excrement, as it were, what you're just eating, and it'll give you back a physiological report. So just imagine now a world in the future where your health care costs would be tied to the detection that comes out of your toilet, and they would say, you've had too much pizza tonight, or you've had too many donuts, and therefore we're going to charge you an extra fee for you. No, there is a sort of potential for that kind of thing. I just thought I'd throw it in there just for the heck of it.
Oh, wow.
It is true.
That's TMI on too many levels, Charles.
Maybe a scary thought, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
This was supposed to be a serious show, but who knows? I don't know.
Anyway, Tamara and I were not Facebook friends at the time, but we bonded over this donut moment, and we've become really good Facebook friends.
Well, see, there you go.
And you know what it was? What Robert clearly was like me. It's like when you have interest in similar things. I'm interested in things Dean is too, but I don't follow. And here's this woman like, oh, you'll be a bad influence. You have to, be the epitome of perfection. It's like, cut him a break. He's human. And Robert was just the same way, And I think, I really appreciate that. I wish everybody was like that.
Actually, the last time I talked to Dean was about a year and a half ago, and we have a common friend named Beverly Rufus who does a lot of research into remote healing, that kind of stuff. And she was telling me that where Dean Radin has gone off to, he now works with a group that produces chocolate. And apparently they do some kind of remote influencing on the chocolate to give you better energy or something. Something kind of bizarre, but that's something he was involved in.
Oh, man. Chocolate and donuts.
That's right.
This is what it's coming down to, really. Enlightenment is a chocolate donut, really.
Right.
See, I like chocolate glazed myself.
That's what I'm talking about.
Chocolate inside, God.
Chocolate glaze. So, Charles, now Tamara knows another Charles, and one of the first emails that we kind of corresponded on was, do you know who Charles Ostman is? I actually asked Tamara that, and she said no. And so now here we are, months down the line, and we're all kind of, converging, in this sphere together. And I think it's great that you called, Tamara. I really appreciate you.
Well, it's wonderful to meet you, Charles.
Likewise, and if feel free to send me emails or something. We'll have a chat, and we'll if you want to, you can go to my website. It's historianofthefuture.org, historianofthefuture.org or .com, either one. I actually work for an institute called Institute for Global Futures, and that's actually a very serious
I want to come work with you.
How
cool.
Yeah, it is kind of cool. I also work at something called the Millennium Project, which is based in Washington, D.C., And Millennium Project is a little bit different. There they look at what's called the 15 Great Challenges of the World, and they publish a global state of the world book, and I'm actually in this thing, like 4 different issues. And the point is we look at very serious situations like water, energy, biomass, all kinds of things that affect the quality of life and the political consequences thereof. Whereas Global Futures is a little more specific on sort of like the business side of how science and technology affect economic processes and that kind of thing. So, but most of my work's kind of serious. I mean, a lot of it's classified actually, but so I'm not sure if you get a job there. But there is actually quite a growing interest in being able to look at a sort of a broader, what I call holographic way of looking at the world, and this is actually a good thing. And just for your own interest, you might want to look up at this. There's something called the NIBIC, or Nano Biocognitive Convergence Conference, and this is actually sponsored by NIH, National Institute of Health, and also NSF, National Science Foundation. And every year they have this. I've been to 3 of these things so far, and every year they bring in sort of the best of the best, the Nobel laureate level people who work in areas like neurophysiology and different aspects of material science and all these kind of things to see how these things fit together as a kind of a large puzzle, like a hologram, because everybody's realizing that any one of these sciences by themselves only has a certain value. It's when they're put together into a larger framework that it has real value, and that's the context. And what's interesting is that it's headed by a guy named Mihail Rocca, who also was the director of the National Nanotechnology Initiative, or NNI, which I also worked for at one point. And the point was that I remember talking to Mihail at one point, and I said, the science is actually less of an issue than the social structures, because for many, many years, and I'm sure Robert will probably agree with this, in academia and also in private industry, had these very separate, like ivory towers, these kind of vertical domains where science was headed by a handful of powerful people, and they would kind of dictate policy and so on. And I said, hell, if we're ever going to be able to get into the world of nanotechnology and be able to apply it in a fruitful way, the first thing you got to do is not the science, but rather this organization of getting these what had been separate groups to be much more collaborative and sort of interfacing in a common way. And so that was the actual initial charter of the NNI. And in a way, nanotechnology was a very good instrument for catalyzing that kind of level of cooperation. So that's one of the really good parts of the NNI and the whole concept of nanotechnology in general. But if you want to get a sense of that mindset, people who work in these areas, look up something called the NBIC, or NBIC. Just type it into your search term, and you'll get a bunch of stuff about that, and that would be sort of interesting.
When is their conference?
Well, let's see. They have one in New York. The ones I went to were here in California. One at UCLA, one was here in San Francisco, and the third one, I'm trying to remember where it was. But they're all three of them in California, but they also have them on the East Coast. They have them each year at a different location. So 2 years ago it was in New York, and I don't remember last year it was. But anyway, if you just look at the website, they'll give you the schedule for the future conferences.
Oh, well then. You guys want to put me back on the hold thing so I can...
I'm going to put you back on mute, and then I'm going to try to get a few concrete tidbits of information out of Charles, if that's possible, in the next few minutes. But T2, thank you for calling in. I really appreciate it. And I kind of had a feeling that you and Charles would have some connection here. And, I would follow up on this offline and, see where it takes you to static land. Okay?
Sounds like we have a lot of common interests. All right. Thank you.
Absolutely. Be well. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Tamara. See you later.
Okay.
Bye. So that's one of my Facebook pals, and she's
cool.
Yeah. What was really interesting is I actually queried her early on in my connection, if she knew you, and here she is. And
so things happen.
Yeah, here's okay. So look, I understand why you've been on Coast to Coast so many times over the years now.
I think like 12 times now.
12 times, because you have
12 times one day.
You have a lot to say. I mean, look, I could talk to you for the next 2 or 3 hours, Charles.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, I don't know. And what's funny is I'm one of the few people that goes on there. I'm not selling anything. I'm not selling a book. I'm not selling a CD or anything.
But the subject matter opens a lot of trap doors.
Yeah, and that's good.
It's like trap basement doors, not trap. You open the door and you crawl down and you're down a rabbit hole. And I understand why Art and George have had you on the show numerous times over here, because there's so much to talk about and there's so much to cover and there's only so much time. So with the amount of time that we have left, I really have a couple of really pressing questions.
Please, tell me. Go for it.
Okay, so people have because I put the word out that we were going to have this conversation tonight. And people wanted me to ask you about microchipping.
Okay.
Specifically as it related to the healthcare bill.
Yeah.
And and I have to kind of, serve the needs of the Vox Populi.
No, that's okay. Listen, I know the company well. They have a chip called a Digital Angel, and they're based in Florida. I've actually talked to their CEO. I mean, I know that whole story. And the original thought was it was seen as a security measure. The idea was to use it for prisoners and maybe people with dementia, things of that nature. And then various government agencies abroad, actually, like Mexico, for instance, had all their diplomatic people who have these chips embedded. Okay, so that was the first one. Then the next one was to go to the military, so that instead of having your dog tag around your neck, it would be embedded in your skin, that kind of thing. And actually, there's a number of reasons why this actually does have some validity to it. However, the flip side of the coin says the microchips be used as a required ID tag. In other words, at a future point, that becomes your social security number, as it were. It becomes your data point, so that it's no longer numbers you type on a screen, but rather the thing that you physically have inside you is the thing that verifies who you are. Could that really become possible? That's more of a policy question than a technology. Technology question is, yes, it could be done. The real question is, will it be done? And that's more of an open. I don't know the whole answer for that. I think in certain parts of the world that probably will become the case, but I'm not sure what's going to be here.
Okay. All right. So again, here coming at you from sort of the X-Files.
That's fine. No, please. That's all right.
Angle. So I want to talk about chemtrails for a second. And there's a great amount of debate in the world as to whether or not chemtrails exist, I personally have an opinion. I think they do exist. Whether or not it's being validated on a high level, Dennis Kucinich confessed to me that they're real on a one-to-one basis. So, either Dennis is nuts, which some people might say he is, or Dennis.
Well, I've seen them myself. I remember driving through, because I used to go to L.A. almost every week. I used to commute there, believe it or not, for some project I was working on. And so sometimes I drive, sometimes I fly, but in many cases I drove because I had friends that drove down there with me. And I remember going through the Central Valley sometimes and just seeing these like checkerboard patterns in the sky and going, that's kind of bizarre. And I have a lot of friends who are pilots, and I actually do a little bit of flying myself in private planes. I mean, I sort of know a little bit about traffic patterns. And when you're in the air, there's something called a WAG chart. It's a map for, there's highways in the sky. And any commercial airliner pilot will tell you there's certain corridors that you fly down. You sort of know where all the typical flight patterns are. And so you see these patterns in the sky that didn't correlate with any of the known sort of flight corridors, as it were. And so you wonder, well, what is that? Why is it there? And, I don't know what it is exactly. I don't claim to have any inside knowledge, but just as an anecdotal sort of way, I have seen things in the sky that weren't typical flight patterns, sort of pathways. And also, the stars that I saw had a really high persistence. In other words, when you see a contrail, which is just condensation from the drop in the jet engine, it dissipates pretty quickly. Things would stay up there for a long time, like, for a half an hour or more. And that's kind of strange. And then they would dissipate and kind of spread out and become like this filmy layer across the top of the sky, as it were, up in the stratosphere sort of thing. And you have to wonder why, what would that be? I mean, there's no, it's not water. Like I said, water vapor would dissipate rather quickly, especially up at those altitudes. Whereas this stuff would sort of stay there for a while, as if it had some other material, some kind of material that was designed to be consistent over some length of time. So why would that be there? Well, all kinds of folks have reasons. Some folks think it might be some sort of climate control thing. Who knows? Folks thought it might be a way for testing for certain biologicals. I don't really buy that one because it's too diffuse. For biologicals, you need to have pretty well-contained target zones, and then you sort of test for the response in these target zones. So that's not really a good explanation. I don't know what the explanation would be. The only thing I can think of, and there's one area that does make sense, there have been some experiments where different materials are sprinkled into the sky, usually around the edge of the ionosphere at very high altitude, as a way to create a mirror for radio waves. And this relates to HAARP, actually. The whole idea of, and for those that know about the history of HAARP, the original reason that HAARP was developed, there's a bunch of HAARPs around the world by not just this one HAARP, but I mean, the reason this thing was developed was really back in the early days, if you recall, before satellites were really common as they are now. There really was no way to see over the horizon in terms of radar. So there was a big desire to come up with over-the-horizon radar. And so one of the concepts was to sprinkle certain metallic materials in the air and then be able to bounce, a radar wave off those materials and then be able to see something across the horizon line. And then, of course, other experiments were conducted. And one of the real drivers for this was the SALT II treaties. And the reason that was interesting was because, as you may recall, in the so-called nuclear triad, you have submarines, missiles in the silo, and then bombers. And in the case of the bombers and the missiles in the silos, you have a direct chain of command where you cannot launch unless you have the correct codes and you have bidirectional interface with your command, central command, as it were. Whereas in the submarines, because there really was no way to communicate with them at the time, there were certain circumstances where the commanders of the submarines could initiate a launch on their own if they felt that certain conditions were met. And when the SALT II treaties were in the midst of being developed, both sides realized that, hey, wait, we have to have a direct chain of command to control launch from submarines the same way we have with our silos and with our bombers. So we need to develop a technology that can be proven as a reliable mechanism for communication. So once again, HAARP came into the picture, and the whole idea was to be able to bounce these very specialized collimated beams of radio waves off the ionosphere and then down to a submarine around the world somewhere and be able to communicate with it. So that kind of worked. But as an unexpected consequence, it was discovered that when they did this with these collimated radio beams, you also created a hotspot. And so the term ionic heater became sort of the common jargon of the day. And then it became known that, what else can you do with this? And so the Soviets actually thought about weather control because in their world, their vision was to be able to change the direction of the jet streams over various areas of Siberia so they could grow crops there because they had this gigantic landmass but they couldn't really use it for anything. However, once they began experiments with this, they began to realize that the amount of energy required to create enough of a contiguous hotspot to cause jet streams to change around is way too costly, wouldn't really be practical. But even if they couldn't do that, there were other things you could do with this. And so both sides then set sort of a